Now, turning to our program, please welcome Rotary past president and president of the Berry Company, Jim Berry, to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, President Leslie. It is my honor this morning to introduce Rob Henken. Many of you know Rob. He is the president of the Wisconsin Policy Forum, a position he has held since 2008. Since joining the forum, Rob has authored or co-authored 6 reports that won national awards from the Government Research Association. Before he became forum president, Rob worked in Milwaukee County government for nearly 10 years, serving as Director of Research for the County Board, Director of Health and Human Services, and Director of Administrative Services. He also has directed 2 nonprofit organizations in Milwaukee, the Alliance for Future Transit and the Milwaukee Jobs Initiative. Prior to moving to Milwaukee in 1994, he worked for 7 years on Capitol Hill as a senior aide to 2 congressmen and staff director for House of Representatives Foreign Affairs Subcommittee. Rob has a bachelor's degree in history from Brown University and a master's in journalism and public affairs from American University. He is too humble to put it on his biography, but several years ago, I had the privilege of nominating Rob for Rotary Person of the Year, an award that he won and deserved to win. He is a treasured member of our club and of our community. Let's give a warm Rotary welcome to Rob Henken.
Thank you very much, Jim. Thanks to all of you for being here this morning at the second to last Rotary breakfast meeting. And you chose such a scintillating early morning topic for your second to last breakfast meeting. But seriously, while maybe not the most scintillating topic in the world, the fiscal condition of the city of Milwaukee is obviously a topic of great importance to all of us, whether we live in the city, work in the city, come to the city to avail ourselves of its many recreational and cultural and entertainment opportunities. How city government is doing from a financial perspective obviously is critical. And I'm really excited to be with you this morning. Raise your hand if you can remember Rob Henken in his 16 years as forum president ever giving you an optimistic point of view about anything, let alone city or county finances. But I'm about to do that. And so we have some good news to discuss this morning, but also, as the question mark in my title slide implies, also some scary news as well. So first of all, just a reminder about the Wisconsin Policy Forum. We've been around since 1913, have had several different names. What we are about is nonpartisan research and delivery of facts in an impartial manner. A big moment in our history actually occurred about 6 years ago, 2018. The Milwaukee-based Public Policy Forum merged with the Madison-based Wisconsin Taxpayers Alliance. That is when we became the Wisconsin Policy Forum, and so we now do our thing statewide as opposed to only to Southeast Wisconsin. I show this slide because people often wonder, well, how can you say credibly that you are Wisconsin's premier nonpartisan, I always use fiercely nonpartisan, public policy think tank? Well, we work very hard to have a very diverse group of funders. We have more than 200 members. I'm not here to give a membership pitch, but if your organization is not a member, you should really look into it. But we work very hard to keep a nice balance between corporate, nonprofit, government, and school district. We do that because maybe if we had too many on the corporate side, people might suspect that we lean right. If we had too many on the nonprofit and governmental side, maybe they'd suspect we lean left. So we work very hard to keep that diverse funding base. But enough about us. This is the report cover, actually for a report that I presented to the club back in the fall of 2022, as you can see, called Nearing the Brink. Mind you, and I want to thank Joel Brennan, who is here, the Greater Milwaukee Committee actually commissioned this research. And it was really an update. Again, I've been before the club many times warning all the way back to 2009 about the extremely precarious financial condition that the city of Milwaukee, in which it found itself, and the fact that that situation was growing more precarious with each passing day. And so we did deep dives into city finances in 2009, 2016, and we again did this deep dive in the fall of 2022. And I just want to review where the city was at that point in time heading into 2023. First of all, as shown in this slide, the story of city finances starts with its broken revenue structure. I think those of you who have heard me speak before, who have seen the work of the forum, know that we choose our words very carefully. We don't like to engage in hyperbole. We don't like to use the word crisis if we can help it. But here, had been saying for 15 years that whether you agree with the current level of taxation or not, if you look at the way we finance our municipal governments in Wisconsin, and in particular, our largest municipal government in Wisconsin, the structure that was created more than 100 years ago really wasn't working anymore. We deliberately created a revenue structure that made our city and our cities and villages very dependent on two sources, the property tax and state aid. And the state of Wisconsin, for many, many years, had a very robust and generous state shared revenue program. And when you just look at the dollar amounts, City of Milwaukee receives more than $220 million a year from state government to support its local services. And that's a lot of money, no matter how you slice it. The problem is that $225 million or so that the city was getting from the state for its 2023 budget was the same in nominal terms as the amount it had received in 1995. So close to 30 years of no change in this foremost revenue source for the city. And so that dark blue line is showing you state aid as a percentage of the city's general revenues. And it had plummeted from about 40% at the turn of the century to below 30% by 2020. That put a lot more pressure on the property tax to grow, but the ability of the property tax to grow, whether we would have wanted it to grow or not, was severely restricted by certain property tax levy limits imposed by state government. So the percentage that was the property tax grew over time, but perhaps not as much as you would have expected given the flat nature of the state aids. Where we did see growth was in charges for services, so snow and ice removal and garbage collection and so forth, fees that the city uses, that's the gray line. And the green line is federal aid, which skyrocketed right after the pandemic and kept the city going financially, but that's a story in and of itself that I'll get to in just a moment. So we had state aids shrinking over time, not growing with inflation, not growing at all. And then what does NNC stand for? It stands for net new construction. So these property tax levy limits, beginning in 2006, state government imposed limits, not only on Milwaukee County, but on all municipalities and counties, that essentially said that you can only increase your property tax levy from year to year by the same percentage that you saw growth in new construction, that you saw new tax base, new properties that you could apply that property tax to. And so that wasn't as big a problem when we were seeing very healthy growth in development and in new construction across the state. But essentially what this is showing you is the percentage increase in net new construction every year in the city of Milwaukee, which is the turquoise, and the state as a whole, which is the navy line. And you can see that typically hovered at less than 2%. In years where we had low inflation, that wasn't as big a problem. But certainly in recent years, net new construction has still been in the 2 to 4% range, whereas inflation was 8% a couple of years ago. And so that limited the city's ability to grow its property tax revenue. So again, here you see the two biggest sources of revenue for our city government. One, state aid not growing at all. The other, the property tax, able to grow a little bit, but certainly not enough to keep up either with inflation or with some of the extraordinary demands on city finances from things like its pension fund and other factors, and just the cost of providing police and fire services, which tends to grow at a greater rate than inflation for a variety of reasons. So what we were seeing over the year was that not only was that property tax levy not growing, but more and more of it was taken up by contributions to the city's pension fund, and also to city debt service. Milwaukee is an old city. It has old infrastructure. It has a lot of infrastructure needs. The way that governments pay for their infrastructure needs, for the most part, involves issuing debt. That's not a bad thing, but it's a bad thing when your debt burden exceeds your capacity to grow your other revenues to pay for your city services. So as the city's debt service payments were inching up, as its need to fund employee and retiree pensions was growing, more and more of that levy was taken up for those purposes. So not only was the levy barely growing, but less of it was available. You can see the dark blue bars are how much of the city's levy in 22 and 23 it was able to devote to its core city services: police, fire, EMS, libraries, neighborhood services, etc. And these numbers are not adjusted for inflation. So no growth in the amount of levy, and in fact, decline in the amount of levy the city was able to apply to its core services, which obviously causes big problems from a service level perspective. The other thing we warned about, this is understandable, as a government finds itself in fiscal distress, if it is fortunate enough to have healthy reserves, which the city of Milwaukee did for quite some time, you're going to have to tap into those reserves. And again, that's okay in extraordinary years, coming out of the Great Recession, for example. The city was very fortunate that it had a tax stabilization fund that it could tap into for upwards of $20 million a year to support its core services and to make up for the fact that it wasn't able to increase its property tax levy as much as maybe its service demands implied it should. But as that reserve was depleted, the ability to draw from it also was depleted. And so that was a very key warning bell. Bottom line, again, not to sound like a broken record, but this is showing you general city purposes revenue by year. These dollars are adjusted for inflation, 2022 dollars. But what you are seeing here, and so we're showing the green is other sources of funding, the gray is charges for services, the dark blue is intergovernmental, which is mostly those state aids, and the turquoise is the property tax. Not only certain of those categories, as I've already described, shrinking, but the overall amount of money available for core services declining. And so that's just a real fundamental question for a government. What do we do? Where do we cut? How do we accommodate these big challenges in our revenue streams? A big problem for any government, but a huge problem, and here I go, I'm going to use that word crisis, a crisis for a government that also was experiencing the problem with its pension fund that the city of Milwaukee was. For years, the city of Milwaukee's pension fund was overfunded, seen nationally as one of the healthiest public pension funds in the country. And really, if you go out across the country and you see the funded level of the city pension fund, about 75, 80%, not bad compared to some cities like our big neighbor to the south, for example, which I think is in the 20 or 30% in terms of its funding percentage, which means how much money it has in reserve to pay for the pension benefits it is promised going forward. The problem is that due to a variety of factors, including the fact that returns on pension fund investments started to lag what was needed for understandable reasons due to what was going on with the stock market, the fact that people are living longer, the fact that public safety employees in particular are able to retire at early ages, variety of factors all coalesced to demand that the city, which from before 2010 was really putting no taxpayer money into its pension fund because the fund was fully funded. Beginning in the 2010 to 2020 period, the city had to find up to $75 to $80 million per year as a taxpayer contribution to support its pension fund. And by 2023, that $80 million was projected to have to skyrocket to the $130, $140 million range. So not only this real big revenue problem, but this additional huge problem on the expenditure side. So I said I was going to be optimistic. I've painted a pretty bleak picture. Let me talk about one piece of good news. So why did we not have a major catastrophe on our hands in terms of city leaders having to completely gut city services? Well, something called ARPA came along. So clearly nobody wanted a global pandemic. But the federal government adopted 3 separate significant packages of relief linked to the pandemic. The last one was called ARPA, the American Rescue Plan Act. And that essentially gave the city of Milwaukee hundreds of millions of dollars to spend to shore up city services while city government and city revenue streams recovered from the depths of the pandemic. And so what I'm showing you on this slide is what the 2023 general city purposes budget looked like. And what you can see is that the city in 2023 was about $83 million short of where it needed to be to sustain its core services at the previous year's levels. Fortunately, these ARPA dollars were spread out over a series of years, and in fact, 2024 is the last year that these dollars could be spent. The city received, I'm going to ask Bill to help me out, was it $394 million? Thank you. We have the deputy comptroller with us, so if I forget a number, senior moment, I can just turn to him. $394 million was the total. There was an allocation of $82 million of these federal monies into the city budget in 2023 that plugged a hole. So that's really good news. In 2023, there were not significant cuts in city services. The bad news is once those one-time federal dollars run out, you have a hole of that size in your budget. So the alarm bells were sounded. Our report came out, said minimally city government has an $80 million problem when these ARPA funds run out. So maybe one more year of survival in 2024, but then a huge fiscal cliff. And that $80 million was going to grow to at least $140 or $150 million due to some other circumstances that I'm not going to get into. So think about it. A general city purposes budget for the city of about $650 to $700 million and about $100 to $150 million hole in that budget. That's serious stuff. And if not taken care of, that would have meant the layoff of hundreds of firefighters, police officers, paramedics, and other city employees with a real deleterious impact on city services. So that was the outlook. A year ago at this time, when I was before this club, hey, everybody, this is real. We have one more year, something has to be done. Well, I think most of us in the room know that something was done. A monumental piece of legislation called Wisconsin Act 12 was adopted last summer. This was a remarkable joint effort by city government, county government, and the business community in the form of the Greater Milwaukee Committee and the Metropolitan Milwaukee Association of Commerce. In all of my years of doing what I do, I had never seen city and county government in lockstep on anything. And in this case, it was not only the mayor and the county executive, but the county board and the common council all on the same page on going to Madison with the help of the business community all together. And so this monumental legislation did several things. Number one, as I think you're all aware, gave the city of Milwaukee the authority on its own to vote for and implement a 2% city sales tax, which indeed city leaders did. And that tax went into effect on January 1st. Provided for a 10% increase in shared revenue. So think about it. I said $225 million, so that's about a $22.5 million increase in the city's shared revenue payment from the state. It also linked future shared revenue payments to growth in state sales taxes. So this problem of that dollar amount, while a very healthy and generous dollar amount, never growing, essentially solved. If the economy grows, if sales tax revenue grows, then the city should be seeing going forward the same percentage increase in its shared revenue payment. That's not going to save the day, but it's something. A requirement that the city essentially closed down over many decades, its pension system, its independent pension plan. As of January 1st of 2024, all new city employees are now being enrolled in the state pension system, the WRS, which is the gold standard, one of the best, most appropriately funded pension systems in the country. So over time, that is going to provide some fiscal relief to the city. There were also, however, some added costs related to Act 12 the city had to accommodate. First of all, there was a requirement that the city maintain and ultimately expand its public safety staffing levels. So while the city was getting more money, it also had to spend a chunk of that money to first maintain and then restore public safety staffing levels to what they once were before all of this fiscal turmoil hit. Plus, the state had some requirements that I'm not going to get into that caused, because of a change in the required assumed rate of earnings, and that was lowered from 7.5% to 6.8%, that added about $40 million of cost to that already gargantuan annual pension payment. So not pure gravy for the city from Act 12, but on net, as I'm about to show you, very sizable influx of revenues to address some of these issues. There are other policy changes in that bill, by the way, that city leaders opposed. Prohibition on using any state or local dollars on the hop, for example. Other requirements regarding changes in the Fire and Police Commission. I'm not going to get into that. But bottom line is Act 12 did a lot of really good things for the city, but it also contained some provisions that city leaders were far from happy about. So let's fast forward now to today. Act 12 passes in the summer of 2023. The mayor proposed his 2024 budget in late September of 2023. The Common Council adopted that budget in November, and that budget took effect on January 1st, 2024. So this was our first look. Okay, we had this monumental state legislation designed, as I said in my slide, to save the day. Did it save the day? And what is the prognosis going forward? So let's dive into that. So first of all, what the city was looking at when budget leaders started to put together the 2024 budget in the wake of Act 12, I had said to you about $150 million problem. That grew by that $40 million or so because of these new pension requirements. And then there were other things that happened. It turned out that the city, to make ends meet in 2023, had underpaid for its 2023 pension obligation. So that had to be made up in 2024. It also turned out the city felt that it desperately needed to change its compensation structure. During all of this turmoil over the previous decade, there were many years in which city staff were not receiving cost of living pay adjustments or very minimal cost of living pay adjustments. And in an historically tight labor market, there was a feeling among city leaders that they had to, particularly for some very difficult to fill positions, had to review that. So long story, but there was about a $255 million gap heading into the 2024 budget. And what Act 12 did was, by providing that new sales tax, which was projected to generate about $184 million, and that shared revenue increase, which was actually a little smaller than I had said before, about $21.7 million, that made up all but about $50 million of that gap heading into the year. So what did the city do in terms of balancing that 2024 budget? And please bear with me, I'm doing this at a very macro level. There are obviously dozens upon dozens of individual budgetary decisions that produce the balanced budget. But at a very big picture, 30,000-foot level, essentially what happened is that the city had one more year of these ARPA funds. It was able to scrape together some dollars that had previously been allocated that had not been used, and it was essentially able to increase that $80 million or so that had been used to prop up the 23 budget. That grew to about $110 million that the city was able to devote to its 2024 budget. So that enabled it not only for one more year to make up that $50 million gap, but to actually do some other things in the 2024 budget. And for us at the forum to actually be analyzing a budget that contained new investments was remarkable, because year after year after year, the theme of our budget review was, okay, where did city leaders cut this year in order to make up for their lack of revenue growth? In 2024, instead, it was, gee, how did the city get by? But again, I'm sure you're all thinking, boy, Rob, that's now that yellow bar, which you guys had warned about in 2020, in the beginning of 2023, that $80 million problem was just going to be just very, very severe. Now it's $110 million. Well, let's start by looking at some of the things that were done in the 2024 budget. There was a change in the compensation structure across city government, a series of changes designed to make the city more competitive in terms of its ability to retain and recruit staff for key positions. The city was able to take a nice chunk of that ARPA money, and this is how one-time dollars ideally would be used, to make one-time investments in its capital program. So a backlog of capital projects had begun to build because of the city's financial challenges. And the city was able to use about $36 million of that ARPA money for cash investment, not to borrow for projects, but to invest cash and to get at some of that capital backlog. The city was able to avoid making any withdrawals from key reserves in 2024. So there was the benefit of both allowing for a year then for those reserves to hopefully be replenished to some extent. Plus, if you're now down to zero in terms of your reserve withdrawals in 2024, and you have the capacity to start to edge back up, that's going to help you with your future problems in 2025 and beyond. That pension contribution indeed did skyrocket. You can see what that number ended up looking like. $25 million of that was because of this underpayment in 2023. So a fierce problem there. But what happened was that new sales tax, the dark blue bar in this visual, shows you the amount of that city sales tax revenue that was now able to be put into the pension fund payment, which decreased that red bar. If you look at 2023, that red bar is the amount of the city's roughly $300 million property tax levy that it had to use to support its pension fund. That number went down in 2024 because it was able to use the sales tax dollars instead. That in turn freed up more property tax levy to use for core city services. So the reverse of the dynamic that I described earlier, where the property tax essentially stayed the same, but more and more had to go to debt and levies. Well, in the 2024 budget, less levy has to go to debt and pensions. I'm sorry, not debt and levies, debt and pensions. Less for debt and pensions, more for core city services. And indeed, after year after year after year, for more than a decade of essentially having to shrink on an inflationary basis spending on core city services, the city was able to actually expand spending on core city services. Some of you may be aware, a couple of fire stations have now reopened. The city is starting to recruit and fill sworn officer police department positions, other key city positions. I was talking to the deputy comptroller. He, for the first time in many years in that office, they don't have a large number of vacancies. And so, again, some investment being able to happen. But, and this is my last slide, and for those who know Rob in the forum, there's always a but. So again, my question that I posed to you at the beginning. So did this save the day? Are we still nearing the brink? Well, the brink looks different, clearly, from what it looked like a year ago at this time. Rather than there being a $150 million to $200 million problem in that $700 million general city purposes budget, as we look out to 2025, we see a problem of about $30 million, and that's not inconsequential. So how did I do my math here? Well, that black bar, we lose that $110 million from ARPA, That's gone. All those monies are now exhausted. So there's no more federal pandemic relief aid. So how was that $110 million shrunk? Well, a few things. There isn't a need for that one-time catch-up pension payment of about $25 million. There is not a need to put $36 million of cash into the capital budget. It would be good to be able to do that again, but the city is not going to be able to, and it doesn't have to. So that's going to free up another $36 million. And then we do see some inflationary growth in the shared revenue program. And if the economy continues to turn along, in that 2% city sales tax, you put all of that together, subtract it from the $110 million, that's where we project a hole of about $32 million. I happened to speak to the city budget director yesterday. He cautioned me that he thinks the hole is probably closer to $50 million. So this is your classic good news, bad news story. I never thought that I would be able to stand before a group like Rotary and say the city is not facing an impending fiscal crisis, because it's just been so long. Again, we were on the front page of the newspaper in 2009 warning that a day of reckoning was coming. And so, the crisis has been averted. The city's revenue structure looks far healthier, much more diverse, more balanced in terms of who we're looking to pay for city services. It's no longer just city property owners, but it's also the tens of thousands of daily commuters and the millions of annual visitors to the city of Milwaukee who are spending money here on food and entertainment and so on, that are now, that 2% sales tax is allowing them to pay into it. So the revenue structure is healthier. The pension situation 50 years from now should be completely resolved. So we're in a slow path towards getting that problem fixed. So a lot of promise, but remarkably, after all of this heavy lifting and all of this new revenue, the city essentially got a one-year reprieve. And starting in 2025, it's going to be back to budget cutting mode. Not nearly of the magnitude as we have seen in the past. And potentially there are all sorts of ways that this $50 million hole could be addressed in perhaps a non-painful way. We are doing work with the city and the county as we speak to look at service sharing opportunities between the two governments that hopefully could yield some savings. Other things going on. But again, the good news, bad news, the good news, much, much, much better shape than I ever could have dreamed when I last stood before you, probably a year and a half ago, and spoke to you about city finances, but still not out of the woods by any stretch of the imagination. And so with that, I would be happy to answer any questions.
If you have a question for Rob, you may do so by using this microphone here. And as always, please keep your questions concise.
Short it is. I'm always interested in that word state aid and then, participation with the state. So roughly, do we know how much the city of Milwaukee generates for the state versus what we get back? And the second part of that question is, how do we compare in Milwaukee to other communities in terms of, are we in trouble or not? Or are other communities facing the same challenges we are?
A couple of great questions. I'll give you evasive answers, not because I don't want to address them, but because they're very nuanced. Everybody wants to know the answer to that first question. Well, yeah, $230 million is a lot of money, but think of where the economic engine of the state and think about how much Milwaukee taxpayers and businesses pay in to state revenues. It's a very difficult analysis to do, and it depends whether you count the Medicaid dollars that essentially are spent here for our population of people who are insured by Medicaid and other federal dollars that pass through the state. So I can't give you an answer to that question. We have looked across all 50 states at their revenue structures. I don't think there's any doubt that our shared revenue program is among the more generous shared revenue programs as we look across the country. I also think there isn't any doubt that we are one of the very most restricted states in what we allow local governments to do to raise their own revenues. So you would imagine that we'd have to have a very robust state shared revenue program. So fairness is in the eye of the beholder. You could argue it both ways, but that's essentially the picture. In terms of the second question, are other cities and villages and governments across the state facing similar problems? Because our big cities are most reliant on state shared revenue, based on the way the formula is constructed, our bigger cities are the ones that have been in the most fiscal distress as a result of the fact that those shared revenue payments just haven't grown in 25 years. So I would say larger cities are facing bigger problems across the state than smaller villages and certainly than towns. Towns made out very well from the shared revenue changes. But I think Milwaukee is unique in the depth of its problem, in large part because City of Milwaukee, Milwaukee County are the only two local governments in Wisconsin that are not part of the Wisconsin retirement system and have this extra, very fierce expenditure problem caused by the pension situation.
Thank you. It's good to go home from one of your presentations not feeling gloomy. My question is, does your accounting for actual tax revenues, property tax revenues, and future tax revenues take into consideration TIF benefits and costs upfront, and what is the impact of that in going forward?
Yep, it's a great question. And so the projections I showed you for 2025 does not try to predict whether there are going to be retired TIFs or new TIFs. But for the most part, TIF is taxing the incremental growth. And so, you know, over the long term, there's potentially a benefit from doing TIF. Over the short term, if it's only tapping into the incremental growth, it shouldn't have a negative impact on the year to year. That said, sometimes TIFs don't do what they're expected. The Century City TIF is a good example, but in that case, there are other very successful TIFs that did better than expected, and so those dollars were moved. So it's a complicated question, but for the most part, as we just look ahead to the next couple of years, that does not take into account any big changes in terms of the way we're utilizing tax incremental financing. That's what TIF is.
Rob, recalling when I did the profile on you for Rotary, I said you were the most important person from Milwaukee in the state of Wisconsin. I think that got cut in the profile, but I think it's borne out to be true, so thank you for your service. The question is on property taxes and the significant portion of property taxes that go to education. And if there's an unanswered question in terms of property taxes and education accountability, it relates to that subject area. Do you have any thoughts on the portion of property tax to public education and how we either get costs under control or get value from the dollar?
Yep, it's a great question, Jeff. And obviously, when you think of the property tax burden for citizens in Milwaukee and across the state, ours is very, very high. Part of the explanation for that is that, again, we deliberately make our local governments so reliant on that one source of revenue as opposed to sales taxes. Some states allow there to be local income taxes, et cetera. But when you look at that burden, you do have to look across not only municipal governments, but by far the largest, about 40% of that property tax bill that all of us get is schools. And so our schools are expensive. We use the property tax. There we're not unique. Property taxation, tying a form of revenue raising to property ownership arguably makes the most sense when it comes to schools, which are used by residents as opposed to other services, which can also be used by non-residents. As you know, Jeff, there's a referendum question in less than 2 months that is going to even increase the amount of property taxation, if it is approved, for the citizens of Milwaukee. And again, we all know our property taxes are high. It's an issue. We now have not only non-residents, but residents of the city paying that 2% sales tax. So I can't give you a factual answer to the question. I will say to you, stay tuned. The Wisconsin Policy Forum is going to be minimally doing a lengthy op-ed piece for the Journal Sentinel, but we're probably also going to put out a brief report sort of framing the MPS referendum question. And we're about to announce one of our virtual Forum Friday discussion programs on March 22nd with Superintendent Posley. So we're going to be addressing, and again, we're not going to say vote no or vote yes on that referendum, but trying to frame it in an objective way for citizens.
Rob, I echo everyone else's thanks. You are our most common Rotary speaker and are among our highest ranked. So thank you for that in terms of our survey results. You talked about the difference in your projection for the fiscal cliff versus that from someone in the City Hall yesterday. It's about a 40% delta. I'm curious, objective as you are, does the analysis ever get into maybe subjective ways of addressing some of the expenses and creative ways of limiting those as part of the analysis?
Yep, great question. So first of all, let me just explain that I mean, our projection was very 30,000 foot and was actually made back in November. And so that's one reason I spoke to the budget office yesterday. Hey, has anything happened that we wouldn't be aware of that has changed this? And again, what they're doing is they're starting to compile information from every single department from city government, finding areas where, oh gee, you know, the cost of fuel went up more than we expected. So this is going to cost it. So the growth from that 30 to 50 million doesn't surprise me, and I haven't analyzed it. And so one of the first questions is, does it sort of layer in a cost to continue that maybe doesn't have to be layered in? But yeah, as we look at it, particularly going forward, it was relatively easy for us, even in our, you know, nonpartisan, fierce, you know, we gotta not express an opinion to say there's a broken revenue structure and there's no way the city, you know, can survive without huge service cuts if we don't fix that revenue problem. Now that we've arguably fixed that revenue problem, I think more attention does have to be placed on the expenditure side. And I think we're going to be doing that. And I think that's just a healthy thing. And I think city leaders are rolling up their sleeves and doing it as well.
Lots of sleeves to roll up. Thank you, Rob, for being here. Just know that not just the public, but many people rely on your thoughtful, detailed analysis, also at the elected level. And thank you for all your work doing that.
Thanks.
Shared revenue. The formula's changed. Milwaukee County got a lot more money than other municipalities and other local bodies, but the percentage of shared revenue for Milwaukee and Milwaukee County was fractional of what rural municipalities got. How do you think the legislature can sleep at night knowing they're choking off revenue from the largest city and increasing revenue in their own districts by hundreds of percent?
Yep. So
why the difference?
Great question. So just to give a little bit more context. So again, City of Milwaukee got a 10% increase. Milwaukee County got a 10% increase. Many municipalities across the state, and we're actually coming out with a report analyzing this soon, got upwards of 20, 25, 30%. And it depends on a lot of factors. I think one of the rationales, I'm not saying that I agree with it or disagree with it, is, hey, we're giving you this unique sales tax authority that we're not giving everybody else, and therefore we're not going to give you as big of a percentage shared revenue increase, number one. I think the other rationale, you already receive so much more money than everybody else, which again is a very context-laden statement, because in dollar terms, yes, in percentage terms and so forth, arguably no. But I'm just saying, those were the two rationales, whether you agree with them or not. But it is a fact that in terms of just looking at those shared revenue increases, Milwaukee City and County capped at 10%, and nobody else had that cap.
Tom Bentley, and great presentation, thank you. There's been some PR in the last week, bad, not good, unfortunately. But the ability to staff jails, prisons, juvenile detention centers with so many private sector jobs, they just cannot fill those positions. How much is that a city versus county versus state problem? And is that a problem we're actually putting up here on the board and solving?
Great question, and it has indeed been in the news. And again, I feel, I don't know what your reaction was when I talked about the changes the city made and spent real money on its compensation structure. You know, from where I sit, this is a huge problem. I mean, so many of you are employers. You know what that labor market is like. You know how hard it is in this labor market to attract and retain good people. And one would imagine that we would all agree that critical local government services need to be staffed, and there needs to be some reaction to this historically tight labor market and to growth in the rate of inflation in terms of compensation increases. I think in no position has that created more of a challenge than for correctional officers. And so to answer your question, it's not a city problem. The city does not run detention facilities. It's a county problem in terms of the county's community reintegration center, used to be known as the House of Correction, as well as the county jail. And it's a state problem with all of the state prisons. And so action has been taken at both of those levels of government to significantly increase hourly pay. We are hearing that that is beginning to see success, but it's sort of like a whack-a-mole type of thing, because one government raises its pay, and so they have some success recruiting for a while, but then the other governments do, and then they lose people, then they have to. So we know it is a big problem in this labor market. Is compensation the only answer to it? No, but it's a big part of the answer to it, and it's one of the things that is driving up government costs, arguably at greater than the rate of inflation, which is why, unfortunately, the bad news is while Act 12 accomplished so much, the jury is still out for governments across the state as to, how they're going to be able to deal with their staffing challenges. And school districts, face the exact same problem in terms of their pressure to increase teacher pay and how that compares to how much additional revenue authority they're getting.
Hi, Rob. Have you, Act 12 has pretty significant requirements for public safety staffing. Have you done any look at the impact of that over time? It seems to me that potentially, I guess, the worst case scenario is that, in a blizzard, you need a snowplow driving in front of that ambulance to get to a call. And if we've got money for the people in the ambulance and not the snowplow drivers, it doesn't do us much good. And so are those lines, where are those lines going to cross?
Yeah, it's a great question. We have not done that analysis. I know the city budget office is doing that analysis. And I know the city budget office is suggesting, again, that while, hey, Act 12 saved the day, you're sort of taking away the local option, our ability to try to discern for ourselves how we're going to make ends meet going forward. So if we have to not only think what the cost to continue is for the Milwaukee Police Department, which itself has about a $300 million budget, if that has to go up 2 or 3% a year, that's real money. And so not only does that have to go up minimally 2 or 3% a year, I'm just throwing that number out there, I don't know what the real number is, just to keep what you have, but if you have to ramp that up, that's a big added cost. So you start every budget year knowing that the first thing you need to do is put a lot more money toward police and fire. Many of us would argue, well, that's a good thing. That's where the priority should be. Many of us would also argue, yeah, but if your resources are limited, shouldn't there be more local discretion on that question? So we haven't done the analysis, but it's a huge question going forward, and I know city leaders are concerned about it.
Thank you, Rob.
Thank you, everyone.